Welcome back. We are joined by Larry Johnson, a former CIA analyst, to discuss the very dramatic developments taking place in the war against Iran. So, first let me thank you for coming back on the program. It's good to see you again.
Hey, always appreciate the invite, Glenn.
So I wanted to, at least start by focusing on this Kharg Island, because this handles 90% of Iran's oil exports. So many commentators have been asking, if this is really what can break the back of Iran's economy. So why isn't Trump going after this? Well, it appeared that, we have reached this point now as we continue up this escalation ladder. Trump, of course, the United States has now bombed Kharg Island. Trump claims to have totally obliterated, that's his words, the military facilities there. He did not touch the energy facilities, I guess for good reasons, but he is threatening now that the oil installations are next unless Iran folds. That is by opening up the Strait of Hormuz. How are you assessing this situation? Because, on one hand, if it's a bluff, Iran, they can't capitulate. On the other hand, if Trump goes through with this, this is like the nuclear option of the energy war. So, what does all of this mean?
I guess Donald Trump reminds me of a casino's favorite client, the one that keeps coming in and spending lots of money and losing. That's Donald Trump. This attack on Kharg Island, it just makes zero sense. No matter how you look at it. They did not attack the oil terminal. Oh, that's the good news. Iran reportedly has 5 oil terminals, so this is actually only one of them. So although it may pump the most oil or provide the most oil to a tanker to sell south out through the strait, this is not, if they destroyed this wouldn't be Iran's only source of potential revenue. But they bombed the runway of the major airport. So oh, good, that'll keep Iran from using it. Except Iran really doesn't have an air force. So there's also talk of the United States invading, trying to occupy Kharg Island. Well, one of the ways you do that is you'd fly in troops, or once the troops are parachuted in, you got to resupply them somehow. So you'd need to land on the runway, except this runway is like, I was told, 5,000, almost 6,000 feet. And the way they bombed it, it means that it's only good for 3,000 feet. Well, a C-17 requires at least 3,500 feet to land. So scratch the C-17, and that leaves you with a slow-flying C-130. So, it's like if you're planning a military operation on the island, you've now screwed yourself from the U.S. standpoint. Iran has made it very clear that if you attack our actual oil terminals and resources, we will attack those in of our other Gulf neighbors. And there are at least 13 different targets that they've already identified. So Iran didn't react immediately or, angrily last night when this happened, or it happened early Saturday morning in Iran time. It was late Friday, East Coast time. So this was, it's like just lashing out to be lashing out. It's not part of a strategic picture, because you've got to sit back and say, what is Trump trying to accomplish? Well, what has been accomplished as a result of this attack on Iran is shutting down the Strait of Hormuz. And in doing that, you've now closed off 20% of the world's oil supply, 25% of the world's liquid natural gas, and 35% of the world's urea, which is needed for fertilizer, which, about 75% of the arable land in the world is above the equator. So that means we're now in planting season. And, the 35% drop in the fertilizer is huge. that means there's some crops that aren't going to get planted or aren't going to grow. And then when it comes harvest time, that means food's not going to be harvested. And there's going to be a drop in the food supply, the global food supply. So it literally can affect billions of people. On the gas front, the prices now are rising very rapidly, even here in the United States. I've been monitoring it at my local gas station. A week ago on Sunday, I paid 50 cents more than I had the previous 5 days. So last Sunday it was $3.04. On Wednesday, the price went up to $3.19. And then on Thursday, it was $3.24. And then yesterday it was $3.32. So it's essentially come up almost 80 cents in a week, a little over a week. That is, I'm fortunate. I'm in a financial situation where that having to pay that amount of money increase. Okay, I prefer not to do it, but I can do it. But an estimated 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, which means that they don't have a lot of spare cash, and so this is going to impact not only their bottom line, but then the real killer is on the diesel front, that the price has gone up over $1.50, and it's approaching $2. Well, every truck that holds supplies for grocery stores, supplies for the hardware stores, for Walmart, for Price Club, for any of these major vendors, their prices are going to go up, and so when the fuel price goes up, it's going to get passed along to the consumer. So again, the strategy comes back. So you're trying to heighten inflation around the world, and in the course of doing that, also put in place a recession. Because what we know from history is every time this has happened in terms of spiking oil prices, there has been a recession. That varies, the length and the depth of it has varied. But we've never had a situation where the entire Persian Gulf has been closed off as it is, and the shutdown of operations in the three, four critical countries there, apart from Iran, when you look at Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and then Qatar and United Arab Emirates. Keep wanting to say Dubai and get it mixed up. So, we're in uncharted territory as far as history goes. You have nothing to point back to and say, oh yeah, this is what happened that time. So the potential of this to create actually a global economic catastrophe is high. And so Trump's response now is to double down militarily, except they're in a situation that the U.S. cannot militarily defeat Iran. You can't do it from the air. Air power has never won a war. And there was an Air Force general that testified in the United States a couple of weeks back that admitted that. I mean, that history clearly shows. So you say, well, what about ground troops? The age in which, 23 years ago, the United States could assemble soldiers over the course of 9 months at bases in Saudi Arabia. They were quite safe. They weren't facing drone strikes. They weren't facing missile strikes. Not today. You could not do that. You could not assemble an army that would be required to take on Iran, number one. Number two, the United States doesn't have that size of army. Total current military strength is 445,000 U.S. Army and about 180,000 Marines. Good luck. 600,000 against a million-man army in Iran. That just doesn't work. So there are there are valid reports that they're deploying for two different numbers: 2,200 Marine amphibious unit, and then a 5,500 or 5,000. I don't care whether it's 2,200 or 5,000. Again, what are they going to do? The notion that this is going to be like World War II, where the Marines are in their watercraft and they're charging towards the shore, and the ramp's going to come down and they're going to storm into fire. That's not going to happen. Those craft would not even get close to Iran. They'd be blown out of the water. So it's unclear how they're going to try to employ these Marines. They could try to parachute them in someplace, but again, once you parachute them in, how do you resupply them? And they're going to be through whatever ammunition and food and water they carry within a day. And so if you can't resupply them, they're dead. Plus, these American planners apparently have not watched the war in Ukraine. And there's a real reason why you don't see mass movements of troops on either side, because with drones combined with artillery, it's impossible for soldiers to move in large units. They'll be decimated.
How can the U.S. reopen the Strait of Hormuz?
It can't.
Can it be done? No?
Cannot. No, cannot be done. Well, it cannot be done with acceptable losses. Yeah, you can militarily probably do it, maybe accomplish it, but the cost, the actual physical cost and manpower losses would be horrific. And in the actual ships, they can't do it just from the air. I mean, there are caves and tunnels all along the side of that coast. Alistair Crook has been there and seen it. Now, Iran's been preparing for this contingency for 30 years. So they're not just a bunch of guys who've built a wooden deck out on the side of a cliff with a machine gun. That's nonsense. If you've not had a chance to watch the interview that Danny Davis did yesterday with Robert Barnes, Robert is an attorney, but he's well plugged into the Trump administration through J.D. Vance. And what he said is that Trump is now pushed away. Anybody like Tulsi Gabbard and J.D. Vance who have tried to counsel against the war with Iran, he's only listening to those who are egging him on. Yeah, you can do this. Yeah, we're winning. Yeah, keep going. Who aren't giving him actually an honest assessment. And we now know that the battle is underway inside of D.C. Between let's call it the anti-war crowd and the let's go all the way to Tehran crowd. So the first indicator was when Daniel Raising Kane, Daniel Kane, the general in charge of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, when the word got out that he had told Trump, this is not going to go the way you think it is, or major obstacles, major problems. Trump ignored that. The next was the leak from the National Intelligence Council of their report, their assessment that had been delivered to Trump a week before this, saying, you're not going to get regime change no matter what you do out of this. And so then when the leaks start coming out that Trump is pushing people away, it wasn't just Robert Barnes, but pushing people away, or that the losses, the U.S. is sustaining greater losses than are being reported. That information started to get onto the press. So this shows that there's real disagreement within the government. They're not all pulling in the same direction on this.
But how about the targets that the Iranians are going after? Because it does seem that they're systematically going after key targets. That is the radars, which are quite important. So they took out the one at the U.S. embassy in Baghdad as well. Again, it's more difficult to intercept Iranian drones, missiles. And we see the military bases, embassies, all of this kind of fits within the wider objective of expelling the United States from the region. But we also saw now this message about a report about an attack on this 5 refuelers in Saudi Arabia. I think they were the KC-135s.
Yeah.
Trump went out and called this fake news, but again, he says a lot of things. So
that's absolutely. I knew about that before it was reported, and they weren't just damaged; they were destroyed. And the reality there now is the air defense system at Prince Sultan Air Base. It's no longer intact. It doesn't work. So the Prince Sultan Air Base is basically quite open and vulnerable to Iranian attacks, and the U.S. is having to withdraw its troops from there, the Air Force personnel, because they're not protected. They're in tents, and so they're very vulnerable to an attack. So this is the loss of those 5 tankers is just another example that Iran had a battle plan in mind, that they were going to do 2 things. One, they were going to weaken and try to drive out the U.S. military from the Persian Gulf, and to do that by destroying the bases. 2, they were going to take out the radar systems that are critical for detecting launches out of Iran and monitoring both threats in the air and on the sea, maritime threats. But they did that. They did that within the first 4 days. And despite the claims that we had these robust air defense systems around the bases, one of the radars was taken out by a Iran drone. Not exactly a high-speed missile. So this then their third objective was to degrade Israel economically, militarily, destroy their infrastructure. I think it's worth noting that Iran, despite massive missile strikes in Israel, has not been trying to inflict massive civilian casualties so far, because somebody said, well, that's just because Israel's censoring that information. No, if Iran was really targeting schools with children, for example, and killing them, Israel would make that public. In fact, I'm surprised they haven't even fabricated that story, as well as try to build further public opinion against Iran. So Iran's been quite careful on that regard. But then also their eye for an eye strategy. If you hit our oil, we're going to hit your oil. If you hit our bank, we're going to hit your bank. And so they just in Dubai, they just took out a Citibank building, or at least hit it. It didn't destroy the building, but it was one of those big skyscrapers, and it suffered quite a blast. The one area, curiously, that the Iranians did not respond to with the counterpunch was when their desalination plant was hit, and so it only accounts for about 8% of the water in Iran, so it's not a critical resource, but they declined so far to go after the desalination plants in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Kuwait, recognizing that could jeopardize, put at risk millions of people, and really create a human catastrophe. So I think Iran, they're being thoughtful about this. They're recognizing that there's a political consequence to some of their actions, and so they're keeping it in those bounds. I think there's at least in the Saudi case, there's a reassessment underway, recognizing that they made a deal with the devil, the United States, back in the 1970s, where as the U.S. went off the gold standard. We convinced the Saudis to go along with using the dollar as the primary reserve, means for purchasing oil, and so the effect, the petrodollar, as it's come to be known, reigned supreme, and then that fostered this relationship between the Saudis and the United States. We guarantee their security against threats that we claim to exist or we'd create for them. But I think now Russia and China are playing this quite smartly. They they're in a position now to create an alternative to the United States, and I see it could be more attractive to the Gulf Arabs. At least it'd be less of a subservient position. Those countries don't normally come in and tell you what to do and boss you around like some servant. It's I think we're looking. This is part of the realignment of the international financial system, too, because in the past, you'd have to, price of oil goes up, and people were paying in dollars. The Chinese would pay in dollars, and then what did they do with all their dollars? Well, they'd buy U.S. treasuries. Well, they're not doing that anymore. One of the other ironic outcomes of this war is before the United States, now let's remember, the United States and Israel started this. And you'd think that the United States would have stepped back and looked at it abroad. What's our overall objective strategically in the world? But no, they didn't. So as a consequence of this war, whereas 5 weeks ago, Scott Bessent, the Secretary of the Treasury, was insisting that India stop buying oil from those Russians, and we're going to punish any country that's buying Russian oil. Today, hey, India, we think it's a great idea. Buy as much of that Russian oil as possible. And, Russia, which previously was selling its oil as low as $55 a barrel to India, is now, it's well over $80 and maybe closer to $90 a barrel. So they are raking in an additional $150 million a day, which is roughly $4.5 billion, $5 billion a month. All the Western analysts were predicting the implosion of the Russian economy, or that it was in trouble. Here's Putin saying, and that's just the oil. They've also got an advantage. They got liquid natural gas. Hey, anybody need any liquid natural gas? Russia's got some. And fertilizer. Who's the other largest producer of fertilizer in the world? Oh, that'd be Russia. So, in literally from February 28th now to here we are at March 14th, in 15 days, they have taken they've shored up the foundation of the Russian economy in a way that nobody could have predicted a year ago. So this, again, this goes along with the changing picture, because when this war ends with Iran, it's not going to end with U.S. troops marching through the streets of Tehran. It's not going to be a victory march of Israelis and U.S. soldiers waving their flags as the Iranians, submit. No, it's going to be the United States and Israel. They're going to have to figure out how to back out, how to get a victory. I did raise the possibility that Trump and his wild rhetoric about, oh man, we devastated Kharg Island, therefore we've accomplished our objectives. Mission accomplished. We win. And so we're going to pull out and we're going to stop all these attacks on Iran because they're devastated. There's nothing left of their leadership. There's nothing left of their Air Force. We win. That's Trump's only way to get out of this mess.
Well, yeah, but that's the problem. He doesn't, there's no escalation dominance. He doesn't get to decide when the war ends. And if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed for hostile countries and, for the Gulf states until they paid reparations for the damage done to Iran, it's very hard to sell this as a victory, no matter how many, parades he might organize.
Well, yeah.
But,
I agree with you fully. That is, that's where they did that with the Houthis. Okay. They could get away with that with the Houthis because the Houthis weren't sitting there continuing to bomb U.S. military bases. They stopped launching missiles into Israel, but they continued to stop ships from going into an Israeli port. So, but nobody's keeping tabs on the ships. They weren't easy to see. But this, how does he, he can declare victory, but the very next day, Iran's going to continue launching missiles, attacking U.S. military bases, that remain, and hitting Israel over and over and over and over until the Israelis they're gonna beg for it to stop.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the Russians, because I saw from the British media that apparently one of the state media commentators in Russia, Kornilov, he linked the British attacks on Russia with the Storm Shadows with Iran's attack on British targets in the Middle East, saying more or less that, well, this shouldn't surprise the British. Now they'll, get it in return. Again, I didn't watch the original clips, and have my skepticism towards the British media. But again, it seems. Also, I'm not sure if that's a commentary, correct? If it's actually based on reality. So again, I don't know the substance, but it wouldn't surprise me. And I kind of made the comment myself, I think like 2-3 years ago, that in the NATO countries, we tend to fight a lot of wars. And at some point, the Russians will be in a position to do what we do in Ukraine. That is, we're setting up a firing position where we can shoot at the Russians, but they can't fire back at us. And
right.
I'm wondering if you see that that the Russians might go for something like this. Again, pure vengeance, I'm not sure, but certainly to restore deterrence. That is, to show that it will have to come with a cost, anyone who essentially attacks Russia.
Well, first, I did hear Alexander Mikouros discuss the possibility that the British supported this launch of Storm Shadows into Bryansk that killed 6 people. That was retaliation for Russian attacks, so Russian support for Ukrainian attacks on British troops in the region, and so we can't rule that out. What I found, I'll call it amusing, is the West is all in a huff that, my God, Russia's supplying support to Iran. How dare they? It's like, pot calling its kettle black. This is, here's the United States and the NATO countries for more than 4 years. They've not only provided weapons, they provided intelligence, they provided intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance data, ISR data. They've planned attacks against Russia. I think, candidly, I think Russia has been far, far too passive in reacting to these. I think the time has come that Russia needs to put the United States and NATO countries on notice that any reconnaissance aircraft, even if it's in international airspace, but it's in a position where it can collect data on Russia and provide it to Ukraine, that it will be shot down. It's now, these are now targets. This is an effective state of war exists between Russia and the West. To back them off, they've got to understand they've got to run away with this cost free, and Russia's motives in helping Iran are not out of vengeance or to seek a revenge against the West for what it's done to them in Ukraine. Just the opposite. Iran exists as a strategic site, a critical node in the multinodal world, or they want to call it multipolar, but I think a multinodal is a better way to express it, because Iran sits at the crossroads both of the new Silk Road coming out of China, as well as the north-south economic corridor that comes out of Russia, as well as its strategic positioning in, with the Persian Gulf, with the Indian Ocean. So both Russia and China have recognized that Iran has some very critical, it's important strategically, which is their main reason to support Iran.
Just as a last question, what do we know about the destructions in Israel? Because, they keep a very tight control over their media, and I think our journalists in the West are quite, obedient or loyal to to these restrictions on revealing losses or destruction within Israel. But what do we know so far?
Well, we know through what we're not seeing. Let me explain. If I'm telling you, oh, everything's fine, but you can't come take pictures, you can't come look, that tells you everything's not fine. They've turned off the satellite, public satellites that are capable of taking real-time images out of Israel. They've been turned off. They're not providing that product anymore. Now, you saw that CNN was allowed to go into Iran and report, and they didn't. CNN was not faced with saying, "Oh, you can't report here, you can't report, turn the camera off." No, they were allowed. It appeared pretty wide access. So this tells me, and having watched, there are a few images that get out, every day. You've had, I guess we're up to 42 waves of missile attacks into Israel since February 28th. That's huge. So that's roughly 3 waves of missile attacks per day. And these are now they're carrying 2,000-pound warheads, or upwards of 3,000 pounds. So this is, it is definitely causing damage in Tel Aviv and Haifa. The port has been hit. The oil refinery reportedly has been hit. There were images that emerged last night of Nevatim, the Air Force Base down in the Negev desert. So this is, Israel cannot take this kind of pounding. And people say, well, what about Iran? Iran's, 15 times bigger than Israel? Israel's got 55% of its population in just 2 cities. Now, as big as Tehran is, with 10 to 12 million people, and some say with the metropolitan area it gets up to 15 million. Okay, they got 15 million. They still got another 75 million people throughout the country in different cities and towns. And the next 9 largest cities in Iran, they're all about 1 million, 2 million. So there are not these huge metropolitan areas. So they're actually relatively dispersed. So the point being, if Iran and Israel are firing the same amount of munitions at each other every day, Israel's going to degrade quicker and faster than Iran. And Israel's going to be in a position that they will not be able to sustain this, which then raises the issue of will they want to use a nuke? And there's that possibility. And I think I wrote an article on the game theory behind this. And, basically the game theory solution is, if Israel is threatening to use a nuke, the best solution for Iran is to immediately produce a nuclear weapon. If they've got a demonstrated nuclear capability, it's going to force the U.S. and Israel to change their calculations, because no longer, Israel in particular, can't risk launching a nuclear strike on a nuclear-armed Iran, because Iran can then come back and literally destroy Israel. An Israeli strike on Iran would cause terrible loss of life, terrible damage, but it would not destroy Iran. Israel would be destroyed. And look, I think they've got, we're seeing again something we've never seen in history, where one country can choke off and close off a critical economic lifeline and has control of it. And the rest of the world, or the parties that are most affected, really can't do anything to reverse it without incurring a terrible cost that they're not willing to pay. And that cost would be loss of life and loss of ships. It would be very devastating for the United States, for Japan. And what's the other really interesting thing that's playing out now is what's happening with Taiwan. Taiwan's going to run out of power in 10 days. What do? So all of this chip production that's there, that's going to stop. They don't have the energy, or they've got to come up with an alternative source. What source might that be? Gee, China? Russia? So China has now acquired increased leverage over Taiwan. Yeah, this is 5D chess that's going on here. The cascading effects across the board. In fact, it never entered my mind when I heard they closed the strait. I thought, oh boy, that's going to be bad for oil. And then when I started looking into it and ran across that this export of urea, I had no idea. And at 35% of the world's supply, good Lord, that is significant. So all of a sudden, you begin to see that the whole strategy that outlines that Iran is in a place now that it's going to be able to dictate terms of surrender. Because despite, U.S. tough talk and all that, the economic pain is going to become such for so many countries that are aligned with the United States. The countries that are aligned with Russia and China, they're going to be okay because Russia is an alternative source to the Persian Gulf, and it's going to even strengthen it further in terms of economic power and political power. The countries that have, coming now, they're relying upon Russia to supply gas, oil, fertilizer. That buys Russians more goodwill. What's the United States done? The United States has kicked off a war that's caused all these countries pain. So when we come knocking on their door, they're not going to answer.
Yeah, no. Well, reading from the media, the talks about Iran. They talk about burqas and suicide bombers, but first of all, they don't wear burqas in Iran, and second, the suicide bombers those extremist organizations have tended to be on the Sunni side, not the Shia. So
right.
It's there's a lot of propaganda. There's no other words for it. But yeah. Well, as always, thank you very much, and for taking time out of your day. I know you're busy, so thank you.
Well, you're busy too, and you're doing great work. Keep it up, Glenn.
播报新闻是我的日常。必须时刻保持妆容和皮肤的最佳状态。当来到人生中最重要的时刻，也是 KS 逆时奇迹帮助我轻松驾驭，闪闪发光。KS 逆时奇迹活肤露全效精华、精华霜，多达5种 EGF、6大冻龄关键成分，保湿效果让我非常满意，小细纹也不再困扰我。我就是我自己的最佳女主角。KS 让我从容自信，光彩动人。我是我人生中的大女主，我的最爱我做主。KS 逆时奇迹系列热卖中，下单请上快点购，透过中天新闻网 App 下单立减50，或输入 CTI 推荐码有额外折扣。